Oh, I clicked the wrong button there. Hang on a second. My computer's having to think through what it wants to do. Here we go. So good evening, everybody. I think it's doing it. My computer's running a little slow tonight. Maybe a Christmas present that I need. It is so good to see you. Again, I was sorry we missed last week. That was my fault. But I'm so glad you've come to join us this week. And this is our final week in this series that we've looked at social and cultural development in the period after the Civil War. Again, this is the last session for this series. And next week is Thanksgiving, and we will take that Thursday off. And then what we'll do is we'll spend the next 3 Thursdays. So that starts with, I believe, December the 3rd. And we're going to spend those 3 sessions looking at trying to get a deeper understanding to the oft confused question about the governing styles between a republic and a democracy. So we're going to, on the 3rd, we're going to go all the way back to Rome and around the 500 BC period. And we're going to spend our whole time trying to understand what the Romans were doing when they developed what they called the res publica for the republic, the things of the people. And then the next week, we're going to go to Athens around the same time, around 600 to 500 BC. And we're going to try to understand what the Athenians were doing when they constructed a series of governments over about a century, in which they were trying to bring, and ultimately did bring, I would say the only, but certainly one of the very few times when a system of government was described for the demos, the democracy for the people. And then what we're going to do is in our 3rd series, which I believe will be the 17th, the third session, we're going to look at the American story. Now, we've covered this in a lot of different ways in here. And so if you've been with me, you've seen it, you've heard me talk about this, we've gone over it. But I really thought when we were doing our series earlier this year on the Civil War, and then in particular this series, I thought this would be actually a really good moment for us to spend time really digging into what has happened to the country. And I will try to withhold judgment, particularly now. And I don't mean that what's happened like there's a problem, there may be, but just to say, what we have now in 2020 and for the past several decades is nothing about like what the founders thought they were establishing in 1776. And words have become weird or changed or redefined. And I just felt like, this would be a really good thing for us to look at going into the holidays. I also want to let you know that I'm already having some great conversations with some colleagues for the year 2021. I'm going to be excited to still be here as long as Becca will let me come and be with you guys. That will be the start of our 3rd year in the Valencia at Westminster program, and I'm so excited to still do that. One of the things that you guys asked me about years ago was, at the very beginning, was doing some sort of a series maybe on religion or the history of religion, the background of religion. So I'm working with some colleagues to try to pull that off. I'm also talking with some colleagues we've heard before, Professor Borglum, the English poet, Professor Heather Bryson, who I was thinking Heather, and I don't ever call her Professor Bryson, who has done some work. She's going to do another series for us. And we've got some other people that we're looking at, even our mathematician friend, Professor Macon, who might come back and join us and have a look at some of the historical figures of math, but the focus being on the math and why math matters. That's what I'm trying to get him to do. You may know that Valencia is still in a kind of lockdown virtual scenario. So I will say that for a lot of my peers, it's been a really hard experience. It doesn't sound like it's hard, which I do respect for a person who might not think it's hard, but definitely emotionally and mentally it's been challenging. So that's what you have to look forward to. I'm really excited about our December series, and hopefully you'll come and join me on that journey. Hopefully, whether you're watching this live or you're watching this recording, you know how much I enjoy being there, and I can't wait and I hope it happens in 2021, where I, and usually Kim with me, will get a chance to come back and see you in person. I really enjoyed the opportunity to spend time with you. So let's wrap this up and kind of move forward. What we saw 2 weeks ago in our last session was that all of the changes developing in the country that was kind of leading to this new thing that we'll now call loosely progressivism had emerged over the 1890s, early 1900s, and had ultimately kind of found its way into the White House. But it wasn't finding its way in the White House easily or simply. And so in that moment, we saw 2 of 3, and tonight's number 3, presidents who I call the 3 progressive presidents. And so this ultimately leads to what I think is arguably the most important presidential election, and certainly the most important presidential election in the 20th and 21st centuries. President Obama's 2008 election might be number 2 in its significance. But this 1912 election, and I'll try to see if I can defend that claim here in just a few moments. So when we left off, William Howard Taft was the president. Now, as the president, he had been put in place, we saw 2 weeks ago, largely through the work of Theodore Roosevelt. If you may remember, Taft was someone who really was more eager to become a chief justice. And actually, in the 1920s, after President Wilson's terms are over, Taft's still alive, and he is appointed to the Supreme Court. He's the only person to have ever served as both the president of the United States and on the Supreme Court justice, one of the justices. While he was doing this, you have to remember, for Teddy Roosevelt, he was the youngest person to become president. And as we've seen in our lifetime with men like President Clinton and President George W. Bush, and President Obama now, when they're elected so young, it really begins to raise questions, what do they do later? Now, John Quincy Adams had also been elected somewhat young and lived another 20 plus years, and he was reelected to the House of Representatives and served and actually died in DC, actually in the Capitol building, serving his constituents and his state leading into the Civil War. But TR was very young. I think he recognized pretty early that he should not have made the promise, that he wouldn't want to run a second, ultimately would have been a 3rd term, because his first term, taking over for President McKinley, was almost 3.5 years in length. So he made that promise. He wasn't going to break the tradition. He'd leave that ultimately to his cousin, Franklin, to break that tradition. And he goes off. And so what's he going to do? Well, he wants to get out of the country. So he goes on a world tour. Now, this is really significant for understanding what happens in 1912, because when he goes on this tour, it becomes apparent to him and everybody with him that he's arguably the most famous man in the world. He was actually called that a couple of times. There were journalists who went with him or who were with him through major parts of the tour in Europe, and they were already beginning to see, wow, everyone that he would meet, heads of state, kings, monarchies, nobility, were deferential to Roosevelt. Now, that's really nice. We can all say, wow, that's really cool for Roosevelt. You may have been in a situation where you've been praised for things, and maybe in a prolonged period of time. If you have, that actually can go to your head. There's a really famous Bible verse in Paul's writing to the Romans where he says, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to, right? And it's sort of the whole idea of keeping yourself humble. And Roosevelt was not someone who wanted to be arrogant, but at the same time, when you start having this many accolades handed at you. By the time the tour is over, as you can see, is over a year, he had over 8,000 letters from mostly in the United States. Increasingly, the latter letters continue to be sort of a message of come back and help us. Now, again, put yourself in the chronology. What we saw in the 1880s and 1890s was an attempt by the populists to win a presidential or win an election to make change. They were unsuccessful in the 1896 election, but their ideas were pressing forward. And from far, Wisconsin, out west, in the plains, not so much in the South, and some up in the North, changes were taking hold. And we saw when Professor Bryson was here and we talked about kind of the changes that were occurring through progressivism, there began to be this feeling amongst people of solutions being offered to those problems that we had talked about previously. So Roosevelt had kind of embodied that as the president. And as we saw last time, Taft was continuing that, but he was not Roosevelt. and he wasn't as aggressive as Roosevelt. So now there's this sort of messaging coming from Americans, hey, come back and help us. And when he gets home, within a few weeks, they're coming to his house to talk to him. And it's becoming very difficult for TR to kind of distance himself from the request to run again. Now, remember, at this point, there's no law about how many times you can run. Currently, President Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, they cannot run for president again. It's not allowed because they served 2 terms. But President Roosevelt could have run again. So remember, we saw this slide before. So what was the problem that happened? Just as sort of a reminder for you, what went on for President Taft? Well, the easiest answer is that Taft was not TR. He wasn't as gregarious. He wasn't someone who kind of wanted to have conversations with people. He also was someone who didn't believe TR's methods were the best, and he thought that he could do better with the more slow judicial approach. But clearly, he also was someone who did not want to be in the position. Remember, of the two, of Taft and his wife, it was Taft's wife who was really more eager to be the president. Remember, as a little girl, she had set a goal for herself to become the first lady. And she really had pushed and prodded and kind of guided Taft's career. So Taft was someone who really didn't want to be there. So when there was pushback from a variety of sources, he didn't respond well to that. That's the way President Jefferson was. Jefferson was not someone who wanted to have any conflict. So when conflict reared its head, he would kind of bob and weave, and it kind of begins to look disingenuous or not effective. And that's the way Taft looked in the process. And he gets sideways with TR in particular in relationship to preservation, the federal lands. And the debate we often have today is the same one they were having then. We have all this land, we've saved a bunch of it, but what if you find precious minerals on it? Isn't there something that could be done for the economy or business that could be used with the land? And that's the debate we always have, and I'm not going to enter into it. That wasn't necessarily a progressives type focus, but I think it is appropriate because of TR to tie in the connection between the broader progressive ethos that we've talked about already and the idea of preservation. Because at the end of it, the preservation would say it's for the people. And that was definitely for TR. It was his idea was we want to preserve these lands in the West so that future generations can see them to some degree in their pristine condition. So these clashes are what's going to turn TR and Taft off, which leads us to the 1912 election. As I said, it's really the most dynamic. I think it's most impactful. There are 4 candidates. Usually everybody leaves off Eugene Debs, who will come back and I'll show you this. Of the 4 candidates, clearly, these were all 4 brilliant men. These are the kind of men that when you sat in the room with them, you noted how intelligent they were, how thoughtful they were. Each had different strengths, obviously. They weren't all necessarily the same IQ, but they were extraordinarily sharp, precise, thoughtful. And when you read or you get to listen to their speeches, the things they were saying, you can see that really coming out. It's also important to note the 1912 election was really one of the first elections in which you see the nominating process. So we just went through this, obviously, through all of 2020, end of 19. We start with Iowa, New Hampshire now, and every state has one. And there's a lot of questions about that, and that may not be the best way for us to do it. We had in our last election here in Florida, we were voting about maybe changing the way we do some of our primaries here in our state. But this is one of the first ones, and this had long been a progressive ideal. Remember, one of the thoughts that the populists had that the progressive ethos will accept is that if you get more people involved, it will help deal with what's perceived as corruption in government. So it's the idea of democracy as kind of a cleansing agent. So more democracy is helpful. Now, again, in 3 or 4 weeks, we'll talk about whether that's true or not, but we'll just leave it alone for now. Now, the ideas of the progressives also make this so important, which we're going to really focus on this as we get to the conclusion of the 1912 election. It's important to understand and remind yourself that, as we said, unlike the populists, who were like a party with a platform, when they lost, you ended up not with one focus, but with multiple focuses going out. And you had people who were progressive. So they might have been progressive within the NAACP, for instance, but they were not interested in women voting. And there were some, maybe mostly women, who were interested in women's suffrage, so progressive, but they were not interested in prohibition. But there were some who were really very excited about pursuing a healthier society through prohibition, but they weren't all that interested in the plight of the worker. And on and on and on we could go. So there's not a unified sense. And this is what makes the 12 election so dynamic, and the door opens for the Democrats. And because TR and Taft spent the last year and a half going into the election fighting with each other, initially just a few things here and there, but before long, it's all in the papers. Everyone can see it. And even TR, if you look at some of the things Roosevelt said in late 2011, he knew that if he got into a battle with Taft, it would be, as he wrote, that's a quote there, a calamity for the Republicans. And it was, which we'll get to. All right, so Taft's the sitting president. TR comes back. Taft tries to have some meetings with him. TR is kind of being distant. Now, he had done that from the beginning. He wanted to make sure everybody knew that Roosevelt, accepted that Taft was the president. But as Taft begins making the changes, so Taft goes after a couple of major businesses in a way that TR thought was unwise. Then the whole battle with Pinchot about the environmental things happen. And from that moment, TR gets more and more vocal. Now, remind yourselves, one of the things about Roosevelt that makes him really arguably the first modern president was how well he played the press. Now, unlike Jefferson and other presidents who basically owned their own newspapers and could basically just write whatever editorials they wanted to say kind of anonymously or from the editorial board, which Jefferson did to great destruction to Adams and to others that he didn't like. TR doesn't have that. He just knew, though, that he had a way, a kind of magnetic personality in which he was able to kind of rope in reporters. And he had, from the years being in New York City, obviously the largest city, had really coordinated and crafted some deep relationships with some reporters that he would kind of bring them in privately, tell them things, let them have an insider's look at things. And in doing this, he was trying to really shape the narrative, which as a leader, I respect that. But there's a sense in which as the president, you begin wondering, is he playing them like a puppet master? Or are they maybe not being as focused as they should be on his policies? So he's in conversations throughout this time with newspaper people that he knows who are eager for him to tell him stuff about Taft. And so it does. At the same time, remember, in both parties, there's kind of the old guard who don't want anything to do with progressivism. And so they begin to see TR coming back as this massive threat. And so they begin battling also, which really begins to kind of loop in this kind of battle over the soul of the Republican Party. And to some degree, some of the things Taft says and some of the things that the old guard say about Roosevelt begin to kind of maybe mislead him, I would say, from his best possible choices strategically into a place where the TR that you meet in 1912 seems rather thin-skinned. He seems rather full of himself, and he begins to start to embrace kind of this status where he almost feels like he's unassailable and not ever, not even human. He's perfect. And I mean, TR is one of my favorite presidents. And when you read the various biographies of Roosevelt, there's a real sense in that you can see that the Roosevelt of 1912 is kind of a different person. And I think he gets goaded into that, but he also causes some of that. Well, it all comes to a head at the convention, obviously, which took place in the summer as always. Now, again, there was a handful of states that had primary elections. So remember, this was one of the things that the populists wanted, the progressives were working on, was that the members of a party could vote for who they wanted to be, which was meant to protect those party elections from just the insiders picking and choosing, smoky room kind of thing. Every place there was an election, maybe 12 to 15 states had these. Roosevelt won in a landslide. Any place there was any kind of election involving the members of the party from a regular populist point of view, Roosevelt won. Unfortunately, there was a lot of, if not corruption, very loose control over these various and sundry elections, whether direct primary votes or just decisions different states kind of organizing committees would have, so that when they got to the convention, both Taft and TR showed up basically with list of delegates on papers, and there were always duplicates from many states. Well, again, as I told you, the old guard, they don't want to have anything to do with TR, and they control the party machinery. And of course, they don't want TR to win, so they do all in their power at the convention to begin to rob him of any chance of winning. He only had a slim chance anyway, because most states did not have direct primary votes. But TR thinks he can sway it. So he breaks with tradition and actually goes to the convention, hoping his personality can kind of win the day. And it does over the delegates. There's reports of him being in the room or speeches being made in which there are cheering moments that go on for 30 and 45 minutes of people just cheering so that nobody could be talking, right? So you're on the stage and you can't talk because the cheering is so loud. None of that, though, swayed the party leadership. So that when it was all said and done, they didn't seat most of TR's delegates. So that guy's there from Mississippi or from Montana or from New Hampshire, and you're not a delegate, even though he thought he was. And so this leads them to obviously feel like they're being robbed. So our current scenario that we're living in 2020 with the presidential election is not the first time somebody has claimed to have been getting robbed, or there was some underhanded dealings, or there's things going on, whether those are true or not. This is not the first time. And so TR ultimately storms out of the convention after they have the vote that makes Taft the candidate. And he goes across the street to a hotel that he already had a room that he paid for, already had a big meeting hall set up. All of his delegates go with him, and they go to that room, and he makes this really thundering speech about being at Armageddon and that he's a warrior for the Lord and for goodness, and he's going to save the day. And you can, again, really see TR kind of getting this Messiah complex thing that I think really misleads him a lot through this campaign, through the election 1912. Now, it's confusing. Officially, the party is called the Progressive Party. I never call it that for a couple of reasons with my students. One, because as I've said before, to try to help them and everybody else that I speak to distinguish the populist party was a party, the progressive movement is a movement with varied and sundry views, right? It never coalesces. And I think it's more important to kind of separate the political from the progressive movement. So again, we've spent this whole 8 or 9 weeks talking about the social and cultural changes, and I didn't want us to get into the long political conversations. So I like the fact that later Roosevelt was asked, did he feel fit enough to do this? He'd been on tour, he'd gone overseas, he had some health issues. He wasn't as healthy as he was in 1900. The whole thing that we've seen in our presidents, that it deeply affects their health, aging. Someone like President Obama, particularly, you saw it, or President George W. Bush, we saw it. That was true even then. And so TR is like, yes, and he pumped his chest. He said, fit as a bull moose. And so the reporters began calling it the Bull Moose Party. And most everybody, if we went back in time and landed in 1912, and you asked them who they were voting for, you asked them about Roosevelt's party, they would not have called it the Progressive Party. They would call it the Bull Moose Party. So that's what we're going to call it. So now you've got a problem for Roosevelt, because he thinks the Republicans that he's worked with are all going to follow him, and they don't. Some do, but some of his most important allies in Congress, they step back. Now, they don't go and support Taft, they just stay out of it. But that's bad for Roosevelt. And so this really means it's going to be very challenging for Roosevelt to win, particularly if the Democrats offer any kind of an alternative. I also don't like using the word progressive in the Progressive Party thing because, again, it misses the fact that on the Democrat side, there also were many progressives who were proud Democrats who had no plans to vote for Roosevelt. They thought Roosevelt had still too cozy of a relationship with big business, and they wanted something a little more aggressive being done, which we'll look at in a second. Roosevelt calls his plans the New Nationalism. And he had written this up in an article before the convention, but this is kind of where he goes. So he wants to have new regulation about the banks. If you remember the populists, the concern, one of the enemies of the populists were the banks and bankers, unregulated. And Roosevelt wants to bring in some sort of a system, maybe even something akin to what had been in existence back when Andrew Jackson killed the Second National Bank. So really Alexander Hamilton's plan. He wanted to expand the welfare system for the poor. And he wanted to keep fighting the trust, but he wanted to do it his way. So Roosevelt's way of doing it was sort of a threat and then a coddling up to, right? And if you know his foreign policy plans, you know, which we haven't talked about, his very famous phrase is speak softly, carry a big stick, right? And so to some degree, you'd almost say with business, he wanted to wave his big stick, but kind of speak softly on the side. And so the threat of his big stick was more action from the federal government. But what he believed was that he could personally work with these people who he, in essence, saw himself as being equal to, not necessarily in wealth, although he was very wealthy, and that he could convince them that they needed to make the changes. So that was kind of his plan, all right? So that's the New Nationalism. Taft's plan is just to keep doing what he's doing. So we might say a conservative progressivism. And this then opens the door for the Democrats because they've been on the losing side, you know, really since the Civil War. They had Cleveland win his two, but still, they've not really been all that successful. And this is where we run into Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson is born in the same basic time period as all these people that we've been talking about, all born, say, 1855 to 1865. He's the only one from the South. He really has his adult life in New Jersey, so I don't usually think about him as being Southern, but that's probably inaccurate. It's more to think of him as a Southern person. His earliest memories, according to himself, were of watching Union soldiers march through or near his home after the family had moved to Georgia. And so watching the whole experience of the Georgia campaign, I don't think it was Sherman's troops, but I think it was on the path that Sherman's troops, so it might have been Sherman's troops, might have been the march through the Georgia that we talked about. He, like Roosevelt, had some health issues. His were with his eyesight. We're not sure he was dyslexic, but he certainly had very poor eyesight. And of course, at that time, no real, you know, optometrist to be able to kind of step in and give, you know, some aid and some help there. So he wasn't the strongest academically, which is obviously, if you know his story, is interesting. But he does, at 16, go to college. He doesn't do well. There's some family issues. He drops out. And then 2 years later, he goes to New Jersey. Now, it wasn't called Princeton at the time, but I just go ahead and call it Princeton because that's what we all know. So he goes to the Ivy League, right? So remember, Taft was at Yale. TR was at Harvard. So we're kind of getting all the big guns in our famous colleges there. And he graduates well. Like Taft, thought he'd go into law. Found it boring. You know, we watch the lawyers on TV these days and we think some of that's very exciting, but I know a few lawyers. You may know some lawyers, and many of them will tell you that it's not that, you know, you're not in the courtroom kind of digging it out, you know, like Perry Mason. You're, you know, it's just filling out papers, having meetings, filing reports, and you kind of go on your business, which is great. Wilson didn't like it. So he went back to school. And he went back to school to get a degree in history. Yay! And political science. And he got that at Johns Hopkins. And then after that, he began writing and then ultimately began pursuing a career in academia. His articles were very appealing to the investigative journals that we talked. Remember when Professor Bryson was here, she looked at Collier's and McClure's. We talked about some of the muckraking, as Roosevelt called it. The idea of doing investigative journalism, which is really what Jacob Riis started, although his was with photography. And so Wilson kind of is flowing in this post-populist viewpoint and is out there writing articles, discussing his views. He had some really strong opinions about the failures of government and what needed to be done to change it. And as you can see, one of the things he really believed in is the president should be really like in the parliamentary system. So if you know the parliamentary system, there's a party and there's a leader of the party. And when the party members gain a majority in the House of Parliament, whatever that may be in the various state, then that party leader becomes in charge. And there's a lot of in and out, and there can be multiple elections in a given year. There can be changes to the party leader. If you paid attention to England over the past, say, 4 or 5 years, you've seen that as they've dealt with Brexit, or you remember our American Revolutionary story. You know, they had 5 leaders in 7 years. So Wilson thought that was actually something that we could do, but he also thought that the president needed to be stronger. So this is one of those moments, and I think TR would agree with him. TR definitely acted this way. Taft did not. But you see, as we now, really since World War II, have had what some historians call the imperial presidency, where from Franklin Roosevelt to current days, our presidents have acted with a much stronger authority than the Constitution actually gives them. Wilson was somebody who thought that was the right idea. He ultimately will become a professor, first at Bryn Mawr, and then at Wesleyan. And then, of course, in 1890, he gets to go home for him. He was hired as a historian, basically, but he taught about government and civics, we could say. He might have been more officially in today's, at my school, he might have been more hired as a political science professor than as a historian. He was very popular. He was very well spoken. He wasn't dynamic, right? So in the election between 1912, he even admits that if you're comparing me, he said, to Roosevelt, Roosevelt comes off so much more enthusiastically. He didn't use this phrase, Wilson, but it's almost like Wilson says he's a man's man, whereas I am more of an idea. I'm more thoughtful. And at one point, Roosevelt says that Wilson is basically shaking hands with Wilson is like shaking hands with a dead fish. Another time he says he has the backbone of an eclair. So Wilson was certainly every bit a functioning human, and he had loves and interests and was actually a romantic, and but he doesn't give that across that image, right? So, but nonetheless, for the students, he was very popular. And I think his popularity was because of how well-spoken he was, but also because of how comfortable he was in challenging the system. And 12 years later, that kind of enthusiasm for reform allowed him to be hired as the president. Now, when he was hired as the president, he began to sort of carve out his path to what would be the journey to the White House, because he brought in the ideas of reform at Princeton that he thought that I would say mimic what he believed needed to happen in the society of life. So for instance, he wanted to eliminate the dining hall. So if you've ever gone to the famous schools, I haven't, but if you know of the famous schools, they have like, and this is still true in England, they have what's called eating clubs. We're sort of like joining a fraternity or a sorority, but it's in some cases, it's actually more elite. There were groups of organizations that he thought needed to be stripped of their power. He thought the faculty actually had too much control of a very old, what he thought was an old system of doing the educational process. This is the moment in the early 20th century where in higher ed history, you start seeing the move toward majors. You all probably, when you went to school, I certainly, when I went to school and now as a professor, you talk to students, what's your major? Like, what are you folks, what's your main field of study? And that was not true back in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And so Wilson's one of these reformers who's thinking, we need to go in a different direction. It ran in headlong, as it often does with administrators dealing with professors, into a clash. And the professors and a lot of the alumni fought back, and they were able to mediate and mitigate some of his changes. But Wilson, again, kind of giving you a hint of what he's going to be like as a chief executive, he still won the battle over, just took him a little longer than he thought. But they didn't like his revolutionary changes. And it is this kind of his writings, which he continued to do in the journals, and his work as the president of Princeton that began to attract Democratic leaders. In 1910, he's approached by state leaders to run for governor of New Jersey. It's interesting, they sent one of the kind of leading journalists who was a Democrat of the day to go meet with the professor or meet with the president. When he left, he writes down that he thought he had met the most brilliant mind in the country. The journalist says this about Wilson. However, he said he's hopelessly not prepared for a political run. He didn't even know the party leaders of his own state, which I don't know about you. I don't know the party leaders of my state in the political party that I'm connected with, but then I'm also not the president of a college in which, as I know the president of our college, and I've been in the group trying to hire a new president for Valencia, one of the things we talked about was we need these people to be very comfortable working with political leaders. So for Wilson to not have that, that's interesting, right? But the Democrats still believe he could be the person because he had these revolutionary kind of progressive ideas. And they do nominate him in 1910, and he is successful. He wins the election in 1910 and begins to move and immediately making changes, much like we saw TR do in 1898, much like we saw La Follette doing in Wisconsin when he became the governor. So these are the only people who are doing this, but there weren't tons of them. And Wilson goes out there. And you can see in his battles with the party boss in New Jersey, a man named Sugar Jim Smith. So he was somebody very rich in the sugar industry, that he was going to have to battle with the Democrat old guard. If the 1912 election had had only Taft or had only Roosevelt, I'm not sure the Democrats would have put Wilson forward, because in the Democrat Party, the Civil War battling back and forth about the progressive ideas, the old guard was stronger, predominantly because in the South, which we've talked about this before, was uniformly all Democrat. And the last thing they wanted in the South was anything progressive, because as we've said, there were some parts of progressivism which dealt with civil rights. So we don't want that. But having been locked out of government for as long as they were, they thought, well, this is going to be necessary. So as the 1912 election's coming up, and you can see this battle, between 1910 and 1912, between TR and Taft, Wilson, doing all these things in New Jersey, is beginning to look to the party leaders like a real possible candidate. He could be the person who could compete with Roosevelt as the kind of icon for progressivism. And you can see the things that he does here right in keeping with the progressive movement, very thoughtful, very working for the worker, stripping away power from the powerful, battling the party bosses, trying to clean things up, such as compensation, 8-hour workday. And you can see even in that last bullet point, his desire to communicate openly. So that transparency concept. Not that he was ever totally transparent, but if he's having daily press meetings with the press in order for the papers to talk to the people, you can see Wilson trying to really appeal down to the people. So this all opens the door for that 1912 election. Now in 1912, there were three very typical leading candidates for the Democrats. You can see them there. One's from Alabama, so he's got the Southern bloc all locked up. And then the Speaker of the House is a very powerful position, and Champ Clark was a very powerful speaker, and the Ohio governor. So Clark and Harmon basically are the ones who are kind of really the leaders of the old guard. And so it took 46 ballots to get to the end. Now remember William Jennings Bryan, he had run 3 times, 96, 00, and then again in 08, I believe he ran. And so he lost all those times, but he had a lot of sway. And so he's not sure who to support. Now you would have thought he would have jumped in right with Wilson. But to some degree, I think Bryan was hoping that he himself might be called on at the last minute for yet another run. But eventually, Bryan throws his support behind Wilson. And then Wilson negotiates behind the scenes with Underwood to get the Southern bloc. And at the last minute, as you can see there, he makes an offering to the Indiana governor to become the VP, and that basically assuaged the old guard. So on the 46th ballot, Wilson is given the nomination. Now, so this then leads us to this coming powerful election. Wilson knows he's got to appeal to the same progressives that Roosevelt's going to appeal to. If Roosevelt or Taft can be united, Wilson knows he can't win. But if he can pull away votes from TR, then he knows he should have enough with the strength of the South behind him. He called his the new freedom. And as I said earlier, it was stronger. So no cozying up to business. Business was mostly bad. The government needed to control the trust. In fact, he suggested in some of his speeches that the government would take over businesses if necessary. Now, TR had never said that. That was exactly what Debs said, because that's what socialism would do, is that the government, particularly the major industries like the railroad or oil or electricity, the government would own all those. So Wilson's kind of positioning himself between TR and Debs from a sense of how that needs to happen. He wanted to not just improve banking, he wanted to completely overhaul the system. He was basically going to potentially eliminate banks or eliminate the banks as we knew them and change the system. And he definitely wanted to use the new 16th Amendment to bring in an income tax. Both Taft and TR were like, yeah, we don't want an income tax. That's not the way to go. Debs was definitely going to go down because, as you know, or you should know, a progressive income tax, a tax on income, is a core tenet of socialism, communism, right? So Debs is obviously on board with that. So the new freedom. So that gives us kind of these four men running for office. Again, Taft, Roosevelt, Wilson, and Debs. Now, here's a graph that the way I like to show it to people so you can kind of see it. I usually would draw this on the board for my students. So if you look and you can perceive this, I guess maybe I should flip it, but if you have Taft, he's on the right and Debs is on the left. So you kind of can just think of how I'm understanding progressivism and the choices moving from right to left. And in the middle, obviously, Wilson and TR are going to battle for the same group. Debs knows he's not going to win. He's been making some traction, but there's really not going to be a way for socialism to take root as long as progressivism's in the room. That doesn't stop Debs, and good for him. Taft is trying to appeal to that I'm a progressive, but at the same time, he's going to keep doing the things he's been doing. So he's distancing himself from TR. And as I already just described to you, Wilson's slightly more radical than TR, though they're really battling for that same middle spot. And if you want to look at it a little more depth, so you could say, so this is Taft's views. And I always like this quote of Taft because, again, when we did it 2 weeks ago, one of the slides I had Taft, the progressive, with the question mark at the end, because a lot of people don't perceive Taft as a progressive. And I guess compared to Wilson or TR, maybe not, but he really is. You compare Taft to every other president before and really the 3 or 4 after him in the 1920s, he's far more progressive. So he's a progressive. I like that. I'm entitled to the same name, progressive, as a great many people who've been going around talking about progressivism and never doing anything. Because remember, I told you, Taft goes after more of the monopolies or the trust than TR does. More regulation, but he is going to know that he's going to have to work more closely with the old guard. Debs, other side of the story, traditional socialism, so complete takeover by the by the government to control things. He's not calling for communism. Of course, at this point, there are no communist countries, so nobody's really calling for communism. And in 1905, there's a big blow up in St. Petersburg, and so Lenin is back there. So there's there's some things going on in the process. So there are communists, but I don't want you to get confused by that. Debs is just thinking what we've seen in industry in the United States is not healthy, so he wants to make that change. So then this gives us, again, the kind of core focus being Wilson versus Roosevelt. And you could really see the difference between the two and how they wanted to deal with business and how they wanted to deal with economics. So as we said, just to reiterate, for Roosevelt, the way he wants to deal with the businesses is kind of buddy to buddy. Although none of the business, monopoly leaders thought of Roosevelt as their buddy. And Roosevelt thought he could really threaten them and use his personal persuasion, sort of like LBJ in the early years of President Johnson, that he's very persuasive and can really strong arm you into a position. Wilson doesn't want to do that at all. He just wants to establish much more stronger set of systems by which potentially he was going to take over business. Now, again, to make sure you're clear, Wilson's not saying what Debs is saying. He's not saying we're just going to take over every business. But for Wilson, it was like, we're probably going to have to take over some for a period of time, just to make sure we can kind of clear out the control of these elite, rich industrialists. And the other is the idea of how they're going to deal with the economy. So like I said, Wilson wants to have an income tax. He wants to reduce the tariff. Now, to this point, the only way the federal government made any money was on a tariff, which is a tax on goods. We've talked about this a few times. If you remember your American Revolutionary story, the tariff was what we complained about. What we call the sugar tax in the story of the American Revolution is really just a tariff. It's a tax on a good. And there's a lot more to say there, but that's really what we're talking about. Roosevelt thought these did not need to be changed, or if they did need any changes, limited changes. Wilson wants to really reduce them almost in total, but then replace that income with the income tax. So that's the difference there. To some degree, Roosevelt thought that the government would be the referee, right, to kind of arbitrate the discussions, much like he did with the coal miners' strike. So then when you look, this is the same information I read the other two slides, so I'm just going to just show you this again. Roosevelt's new nationalism versus Wilson's new freedom. All right? So the 1912 election goes this way, and the most important thing that I want you to see is when you look at these four men, this is why this election I think is so vital for us. There were only progressive choices. What's happened, if you kind of trace the journey of this whole series we've been on, and you look at the attitude of the American people, you go from a moment in, say, 1870s, all the way here to 1912. And in that 40-something years, the American people have transformed to where now, of your four choices for president, they're only progressive. The outcome you probably know already, Wilson wins. But notice, he only gets 42% of the vote, of the popular vote. If you put Roosevelt's and Taft's together, they've got 50% of the vote. So clearly, Roosevelt's views that if he got in the race, would be a calamity, comes true. If you put them together, the green up there is for the Democratic part, for Wilson, and the Electoral College, which of course is the only one that really matters, was a complete, wipeout, great for the Democrats. It would have been very different, obviously, had the Republicans been united in the process. But what I think is more important is if you look at this, the Republicans got 50%. The Democrats got 42%. But if you dig into the details and you look at probably about half, maybe a little less, of the Democrats voting for Wilson would have considered themselves progressive, all the Northern and Western people. You really take all of TR's 27.5%. You take all of Deb's 7.5%. And for Taft, it's hard to say. Some would say 10%. I think it's a little less than that because there's not too many progressive Republicans who vote for Taft. There are some conservative progressives who vote for Taft, but there's still a pretty strong old guard, which is probably the 20% that he got. You're looking at 60 to almost 70% of the American people voting, of those who voting progressive. So regardless of who wins, the 1912 election is this moment that kind of transforms the country. And that's why it's such a bellwether election that we need to kind of note. Now, real quick, I want to wrap it up here. With Wilson in office, some of this stuff we've actually already seen. And if you know Wilson's story and you know where we are in time, unfortunately for him, and he admits this when it happens, the coming of World War I in 1914 was the worst thing possible. He says, my whole training and preparation and thought about the presidency was all in domestic affairs. And it looks like my whole time is going to be focused on international affairs. And it really is. As early as 1913, there's a blow up in Mexico. He actually goes and gets involved. He actually sends more federal troops to intervene in Central and South America than Taft and TR, I think, combined. So that's a whole different conversation with foreign policy and imperialism. But in general terms, he's going to find his time swallowed by the problems of the foreign policy. So you don't have as much time with Wilson as this progressive domestic leader, but he still does some things in 13 and going into 14 and really even into 16 that he's going to fight for and pull off. And as we said, economics and business. So in economics, he does exactly what he said he was going to do. He pulls it off pretty simply, gets a new tariff reform, really drops those tariffs, not to zero. That's going to be a little bit longer before they're dropped to zero. They'll still be around in the 1930s, going into the 40s, but they'll largely be replaced by the income tax under Wilson. And then in the war, the income tax will be expanded. This is one of the things I always complain about with progressives is like, oh, the income tax will only be on the super rich. And I'm like, that's what government says all the time. That's never what government does. Taxes are on everybody in a way that's very impactful for middle and lower income families. And he does make changes to the Federal Reserve. It's interesting, though, if you compare what he does to what TR said, you realize, oh, basically Wilson's Federal Reserve Act was pretty much what TR was going to do. And you can say that both here and with business, that Wilson does more of actually what TR said than he did of his own plan. That might have been because he knew he had a bunch of Republicans in Congress and he needed to kind of work with them to some degree. In business, he sets up the Federal Trade Commission. He strengthens the Antitrust Act, gets more power for corporations, but he never tries to implement kind of full control or take over power as he had threatened. And he has a whole raft of worker protection laws, which, we would expect to see from a progressive. Wilson's, particularly his first term, his second term is all swallowed up by the war. But his first term, there is a heavy dose of good progressive domestic actions. With that, we really come to the end of the series. So let's recap here in the last few minutes to say, what have we seen? Because this is a transformational, I think when I look at the battles, say, of the past 20 years in our country, and there's obviously specifics involving President Bush, Obama, and President Trump, but when you look and you step far enough back, I would suggest that the battles that the country has been wrestling through all stem back to this moment and trying to understand how do we best structure the country in this time of heavy industry, economics, and now in our own time, technology, computers, consumerism since the 1950s. And it all goes back to progressivism. So let's see if we can recap this. Remember, what we saw over the first 4 or 5 sessions was that the country was not itself. It was no longer the country that had happened before. And that makes sense if you study the Great Pattern series that I've talked about before. Civil War was the great crisis of the previous 80-something years. And now a new day is dawning. But there still were some lingering thoughts from the old, and this kind of gets expressed in kind of, as I've described, maybe putting on clothes that don't fit exactly right. And so in industry in the North and out West, the rise of monopolies, the power of the railroad, all that leads to transformation in urban society, as well as the challenges for the worker. Very few workers in the 1960s were working for an industry. They were basically working in what we would call small businesses or farmers on their own. Now they're working in a place getting a salary. And there's a lot of transformation we talked about, even a warping, my word, of the American dream, from just the pursuit of my own freedom to do what I wish, liberty, to being rich. And you hear people today talking about the American dream. They're talking about economics. They're talking about having the rich is to be able to be independent. And that's not what the founders were thinking about for the first 250 years of our country. Civil rights battles for women, for African Americans, for Hispanics, for Asian Americans, all of this is kind of wrapping up. And of course, the South still trying to rebuild itself in the New South. So then this led to the coming of the populists. And so out of the West, with a long list of enemies, bankers, corrupt politicians, the railroad, these kind of saviors from the West formulate a party and really begin to articulate specifics, such as the income tax that we just talked about, direct elections that we just talked about, government control of, say, banks that we just talked about. Almost everything the populists put on their 1892 platform, first developed in Ocala, Florida, is now what we do in the country. Direct election of senators, private voting, there's women getting to vote. And these are, we're not saying these are bad things at all, but they were revolutionary changes. And to some degree, the populists win, even though their party doesn't win. And so these progressive ideas bring forth and kind of is the soup, you might say, in which a bunch of young leaders like Jane Addams and Ida B. Wells and Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois and Theodore Roosevelt and Jacob Riis are all born into. And so these reformers all begin emerging by the 1880s and 1890s, demanding change, and they do. As progressivism takes root, as I showed you this 3 or 4 sessions ago, there begins to be kind of an ethos, which on the one hand, I would suggest sounds good and makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, I would suggest all of these to some degree have they're fraught with peril, right? So if experts can only lead, then you're going to end up with elitism. If you're helping those who are less fortunate, you're almost by nature and default going to continue to, one, say to people, you're less fortunate or you can't help yourself, which is demeaning. And two, you kind of need to keep them in that spot. If you and your business or your power is connected to helping those people, if you actually do make it better so they're not there, you got nothing to do. So there's an insidious side to kind of what comes out of that. The idea of using systems, education, organization, those are all very positive, but at the same time, there's issues in which you start going, wait a minute, I'm not sure those are always the best. And then perhaps most importantly, which we'll focus on 3 weeks from now, is the idea of, does democracy really clean things? I will just tell you this, on the front end, our founders would say no. You and I can be asking the questions now 100, 120, 130 years later. We might have the evidence to make an assessment about that. This was a time of the most explosive change of changes to the Constitution, except for the beginning. So there's the moment when we do the Bill of Rights, what we call the Bill of Rights. They didn't call it that, but the first 10 amendments. You remember in Reconstruction period, there were 3 changes. That was another pretty big change right there in the 1865 to 1875 window. And now here, from 1909 to 1920, 4 big changes come rushing in. And I know we didn't talk about prohibition, and you might be someone who thinks, well, prohibition was a terrible idea. Why is it even on the list? But when you remind yourself, like what we saw back here, right? You're trying to help people who can't help themselves. So if you're trying to help people deal with alcohol abuse, you're trying to help battered women, you're trying to help end abandoned children, well, those all come from alcohol. That's what the prohibition crowd would argue. Then how do you eliminate those problems? Well, you just eliminate alcohol. We can make a conversation about that really probably raises the validity of that idea. And we know ultimately there's another amendment that gets connected to prohibition that ends that, or basically repeals it. It's the only amendment in the Constitution like that. But still, it's an important aspect of the change. We didn't spend any time here, and we're not going to spend any time here. And I showed you this slide once before, but I just want to passingly say this again. When you're looking at the impact of progressivism, it absolutely impacts our foreign policy. And there's a warping and a changing that, not surprisingly, these 3 presidents we just talked about really lead how that change happens. And the ideas of the core concepts of helping the less fortunate, having an elite group of people who do it for themselves, and kind of bringing in that democracy is going to be core to what the American foreign policy will be over, well, I'd say it still is today. So there's a lot more we could say there, but we don't have time for that. So what does this mean, right? What's the long-term impact, right? Well, one, as I've already said, progressivism is the dominant philosophy of the country since 1912, really since 1900, but 1912 kind of nails it in. It's not really challenged until Reagan's election in 1980. And part of our problems post-Reagan is that the Republicans in 1988 did not choose another deep conservative, small government conservative like Reagan when they chose George Herbert Walker Bush. the idea of democracy. So if you read the speeches of, say, Roosevelt, he never talks about our country being a democracy. He uses small d democracy. When you get to 1912, you read some of his speeches, he starts talking about us as a democracy. 1914 to 1920, that's all Wilson ever says, the word democracy. So you can sort of see this shift when you get to FDR, you get post-World War II, it's all democracy all the time. We'll talk more about this in a few weeks. There's no progressive party. We did talk about it. Between 1912 and 1916, there's some who want, in the Bull Moose Party, who want Roosevelt to step in. There are some Democrats who want him to step in. They don't think Wilson's done as good a job, but he really just wants to kind of heal the wounds with the Republicans. And so there's never a party that really kind of jumps in. They do try to, the Progressives have a party in 1916, but they nominate Wilson. I mean, Roosevelt, he won't do it. So they basically just die away right then. World War I begins to really kind of taint this. And this is interesting if you like following the political parties, because of the way TR handled himself in 12, and then what happens in World War I, which we don't have time to go into it. So just trust me on it. It gets messy at the end. Wilson's not successful, and it begins to color people's views about progressivism. Remember I told you the political parties are having this tug of war. Well, it's like the Republicans let go of the rope. And from 1920 on, the Republicans largely go, yeah, we're not progressive. In fact, they start saying, you guys are the progressives. That works in the 1920 elections. But then with the Great Depression in 29 and the coming of FDR is able to shift that narrative because he is seen riding in to save the day. Many people perceive the New Deal as being very, very successful. So the progressive ideas that had been formulating in the first 2 decades, Roosevelt, FDR sort of saves and highlights, which is a key point in kind of moving forward. And between that and the fact that in the 20s, the Democrats begin winning all the major cities. So to the point that you can see how quickly they first get labeled, but then eventually with FDR embrace, we are the progressive party. So those of you keeping along with us, watching the Democrat Party in the South and seeing it run some of the most openly racist campaigns ever, even for the president, this is a white man's country. Now they begin making that shift. It's not fully done because there's still that block in the South that is old guard. That's a whole different conversation that goes there. In economics, coming out of World War II with FDR, the idea of, say, Wilson or even Debs' control of government and control takes over with the writings of John Maynard Keynes. And it remains, the slide I showed you about foreign policy, progressivism remains our dominant idea of the US foreign policy. When John F. Kennedy puts forth the Peace Corps, he's really talking in a progressive way of we need to come help you. We're going to build bridges. We're going to build education. But we're going to do it our way. We're going to come in and spend our money because you obviously can't do it for yourself. So throughout this century and to today, the idea of the US foreign policy is the banker of the world, the marshal of the world, the builder of the world. All that's connected to the progressive ideas that become embedded in our foreign policy. And ultimately, like I said, it's not really challenged until such time you get to Reagan. And then after that, it's not challenged. I think this is the last slide. I'm gonna double check really quick. Yeah, that's what I thought. So I'm gonna leave it right here as we kind of wrap it up. Progressivism becomes this dominant shift and change. A lot of positives we saw when Professor Bryson and I were talking about the different things coming out of the progressive movement. At the same time, deeply altering the nature and the kind of, not character, but the kind of core ideas of the American story as had been laid out in the previous 200 years, going back to the founding of the country and back into colonialism. A lot of those are changes many of us are glad were made. I'm a father of 3 daughters. I'm glad they can not only vote and run for office, and kind of regardless of what you think about the 2020 election, I like the fact that there's finally been a woman elected to one of the 2 highest offices. I may not agree with her ideas, but I'm glad she was elected. I'm glad we continue to fight those battles about civil rights, for instance. We still have a lot of work to do, obviously. But there's other questions about how things like democracy, income taxes, urbanism, power technology, power monopolies, is Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, are they monopolies? Maybe they are. Maybe a man like Roosevelt or Wilson, TR or Wilson, maybe they would really be doing more to break them up. I don't know. We're living in that world right now. Thank you so much for spending time for me with this over this 8 or 9 weeks. Hopefully you found this very exciting and interesting. As usual, I wish we were face to face so we could have an easier way of asking questions. If you have any questions about the series, about anything said today, please email me or get the questions to Becca. She'll let me know and we'll talk about it. Again, thank you. I'm honored to spend time with you guys. I miss seeing you face to face. Enjoy your Thanksgiving, whatever you're getting to do next week. And I will see you in 2 weeks on December the 3rd. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Crossman.
Thank you, Carl. That was good. That was interesting. All that about progressivism. I'd like to learn